Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirikoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my must-draft wide receivers for the 2022 fantasy football season. Now, a couple days ago, I was hanging out with a friend, and he was drafting a fantasy team, and I was like, all right, you know what? I'm going to let you do you. If you need any help, ask, right? A couple rounds go by, and I peek in, just wanted to see how it was going. And I began to realize there were a lot of players that were still available on the board that shouldn't be by the time he got to the 5th, 6th, 7th rounds. I'm like, why are these wide receivers available for you? Like, what's going on with this league? What's the scoring format? How many teams are in it? Why are these guys still available? So I took it upon myself to travel to these websites, Yahoo, ESPN, NFL.com, because I was specifically interested in seeing the ADPs of these given players, wide receivers in specific, because when I saw guys like Courtland, Sutton not off the board by the time we're getting into the late 5th, early 6th rounds in a 12-team half PPR league, I'm thinking to myself, wait, were these players just hidden? And many people may have just, not even realized that they weren't taken by the time their selection was up. And what I began to find was that there are so many wide receivers that not only have breakout potential, but have solid base floors of opportunity going into the 2022 season that are being undervalued on these sites. Players that you should be drafting, and you have to make sure that you have some sort of reference of draft rankings to ensure that you're not skipping on the values at hand. So over the course of today's video, we're going to talk about these must-draft breakout wide receiver options, 2 of them sitting behind me, and many more, in order to give you some insight as to which wide receivers I'm going after in my later rounds, players that I want to make sure are my wide receiver 2s, 3s on my roster in order to help me win a 2022 fantasy football championship. Now, speaking of winning a fantasy football championship, for those of you who are looking to do exactly that this season, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making fantasy football content on the daily for the entirety of the 2022 season. Again, whether it's setting you up and getting you ready for your drafts this upcoming weekend or during the regular season, where we'll have waiver wire Mondays, rankings from Tuesday through Thursday, of course, must start players, live streams galore, which includes our Kickoff with Kirikoff Sunday morning stream, where we're going ahead, giving you free rankings and helping you win your fantasy football leagues. Thank you very much. All right, also one more thing I wanted to mention. If you guys haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy and you're looking for my fantasy football draft rankings, that's the best way to do it. If you go ahead and travel to Underdog Fantasy and use promo code Andrew, when you make a first-time deposit, you will go ahead and get an individualized email from me, which includes my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings. They will be sent from my email. It will typically take about 24 hours to get it to you. And every Saturday, up until the beginning of the season, there will be updated rankings. So the next updated rankings will come out September 3rd in the AM. So be sure to check that out. Also, when you sign up using promo code Andrew and make a first-time deposit, you're not only going to get those fantasy draft rankings, you're also going to get a deposit match up to $100. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check that out. Draft some teams via Underdog Fantasy. Have fun. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about some of these must-draft wide receivers. The 2 that I wanted to first and foremost mention were Jeudy and Courtland Sutton. So when I went ahead and traveled to some of these websites, the ADPs of these players were ridiculous. Now, in comparison to where Underdog has them, right? Underdog has Courtland Sutton at 33.2 and Jeudy at 43.5. Okay, those seem about reasonable. Courtland Sutton coming off the board, late 3rd round. Again, he should be a top 15 wide receiver, so that makes absolute sense. But when I went over to ESPN and I saw that his ADP was 57 and that Jeudy's was 54, that pretty much caught me by surprise. And then I went over to Yahoo's ADPs. Courtland Sutton has an ADP of 49, almost a full round later, more than actually a full round later. And then Jeudy had an ADP of 65.2. I thought to myself, what is happening? And then I traveled to, the most egregious ADP drop that I've ever seen, to NFL.com. And I found that their ADP had Courtland Sutton at 97.5 and Jeudy at 86.5. That in itself gave me fear that people are actually drafting teams in 2022 without having the full scope of when these players should be drafted. So I want to talk about some of these players, specifically these 2 Denver Broncos wide receivers, mainly because, again, when you bring Russell Wilson into this offense, you bring Nathaniel Hackett into this offense, it's going to change everything. But to give you a little bit of a background on Courtland Sutton, again, in 2019, he was a top 20 fantasy wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. In fact, was the number 19 that year, in which he was averaging 11.65 fantasy points per game, got over 72 receptions, over 1,100 yards, and 6 receiving touchdowns, 186 total fantasy points. A great season, and he was catching the ball from quarterbacks like Drew Lock. Now you're going ahead and making that upgrade, which is only going to help him in the long run. Now going into 2020, he tore his ACL and obviously had to recover from that. In 2021, there wasn't much of an acclimation period. He immediately became the wide receiver 1 of this team and took reign of that position as he was, just dominating in terms of targets and fantasy points from weeks 2 through 6 of the 2021 season. In fact, throughout that span of time, 10 targets per game that led to 14.74 half PPR fantasy points per game, was the number 11 overall wide receiver throughout that span of time, with Teddy Bridgewater as his quarterback. So we thought to ourselves at the beginning of 2021, well, Courtland Sutton's back. We're in a great position. All is well. Continue on. And little did we know, going into weeks 7 through 18, Courtland Sutton had his hands on an invisibility potion. He drank it, disappeared, and never, ever again got even close to the number of targets that we saw from the beginning of the season. In fact, from week 7 through 18 of last season, he was only averaging 4.09 targets per game and 4.15 fantasy points per game. So obviously, we've seen him with opportunity succeed. And when we've seen him with terrible quarterback decision-making, it's quite the opposite. Nonetheless, let's talk about Jeudy, his rookie year. Back in 2020, when Courtland Sutton went down with that injury, he was pretty much thrusted into the position of being the number 1 wide receiver option of the team. And of course, he had 113 targets that led to only 52 receptions, 800 yards, 3 touchdowns, 131 points, which made him the number 44 wide receiver in his rookie season. Not a great year, but it was promising because we knew that the targets were going to continue to be there. Now, even though in his rookie year, he had the most incompletions that were the quarterback's fault, 26 of them coming there, and 12 dropped passes, again, that's 38 total receptions that he could have potentially had that could have added on to the 52, and he could have easily been a top 24, maybe even better in his rookie season. Now, going into last year, dealt with an ankle injury. That certainly did plague him for the entire, even after he came back from said injury, really wasn't the same. Now, going into 2022, I mentioned it before, you're getting Russell Wilson. You're not only getting Russell Wilson, but you're also extracting the potential of Tim Patrick taking work from these 2 wide receivers. Tim Patrick, who's been relatively solid in terms of a fantasy point option for the Denver Broncos offense, unfortunately tore his ACL this offseason. So we know Courtland Sutton and Jeudy, they're not coming off the field. And when you add that to the formula of Russell Wilson, a guy that, from 2017 through 2020, every single year, 31 plus passing touchdowns. Obviously was not able to accomplish that last season due to the injury that he sustained and the time he missed. But again, when you look at Russell Wilson's career, since 2015, he has averaged 2 passing touchdowns per game. Again, he's been able to support 2 top 12 wide receivers multiple times throughout his career. I mean, when you even go back to 2015, he was able to make Doug Baldwin the number 8 overall wide receiver. The following year, Baldwin, number 10. The following year in 2017, Doug Baldwin was the number 13 wide receiver. So it's been a very long time since Russell Wilson hasn't been able to support a top-level wide receiver, because even after Doug Baldwin, his career ended with the Seattle Seahawks, Tyler Lockett picked up the pace. And from 2018 through 2021, Tyler Lockett's always been a top 15 wide receiver in fantasy football. You add DK Metcalf into the conversation the last 2 years, you think maybe Tyler Lockett was going to take a step back. In fact, Tyler Lockett only got better. DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett in 2020 were the number 9 and 7 overall wide receivers. This last season, in 2021, they were number 12 and 13 overall wide receivers in half PPR in terms of total fantasy points scored. So when you have 2 young, talented wide receivers, you're bringing in the best quarterback they will ever play with, along with a new head coach who is offensive-minded, who's going to implement a West Coast scheme, which is a lot of passing. The sky's the limit for these 2. Again, when we've talked about what has made Russell Wilson such a dominant force in fantasy football and specifically helping his wide receivers, a lot of the time it has been his deep passing ability. Again, since 2019, Russell Wilson has been the number 1 quarterback in terms of deep passes 20 or more yards down the field. In fact, since 2019, he's number 3 in attempts, number 2 in completions, number 2 in passing yards, and number 1 in passing touchdowns of 20 or more yards down the field. And obviously, both DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, their fantasy point contributions have relied upon this level of success from Russell Wilson. Again, DK Metcalf in the last 3 years, 20 or more yards down the field, 30 catches for 1,100 yards, 11 receiving touchdowns, while Tyler Lockett, pretty much in the same boat, 38 catches, 1,291 yards, 11 receiving touchdowns in the last 3 seasons. There's been a lot of production in the deep passing game. Obviously, Courtland Sutton, in terms of this offensive threat, had 29 targets of the same category last season, which will certainly give him the inside track to dominating those deep passing targets. But who's to say that Jeudy isn't capable of doing the same? I think both these guys are talented enough, and with the right combination at the quarterback position, should be able to succeed immensely. Again, Russell Wilson really hasn't, disappointed in terms of producing fantasy point wide receivers yet. Like we talked about earlier, these guys' ADPs are far too low than they should be going into the 2022 season. Another stat that I wanted to mention before we move on to the next wide receivers is that from week 7 through 17, the Denver Broncos have the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position. So after the first week, 6 weeks of the season, once this team has gone ahead, build their rapport. I mean, I know they've been building that all off season, but once they've gone ahead and really found that full click, from 7 through 17, these guys should be taking over the league and dominating and finding themselves scoring a lot of fantasy points, which is the hope. Let's go ahead and move on to the next wide receiver I wanted to mention is Gabriel Davis of the Buffalo Bills. Listen, I think Gabriel Davis is one of these wide receivers that, again, many people may not be familiar with the name, and that's what kind of, leaves him going down draft boards. But on Underdog, currently has an ADP of 40 overall in terms of where he's plucked off the board in the 4th round. Relatively reasonable considering the kind of upside he has. Again, the last time many of us saw him, 10 targets, 8 catches, 201 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns against the Kansas City Chiefs in that playoff game. Yet on Yahoo, ADP of 70. On ESPN, ADP of 68. On NFL, ADP of 96. I mean, the fact that it's almost close to double the ADP on some of these sites is ridiculous to me, considering how much value Gabriel Davis presents, and especially considering the offense he's associated with in the situation that is being presented in 2022. Now, what I mentioned the other day during our tier list video was that what really has held Gabriel Davis back in the past has been the ability to get on the field, play offensive snaps, because there have been other wide receivers in this roster that have certainly been ahead of him, whether it's Cole Beasley, John Brown, Emmanuel Sanders. Guys have taken away snaps from him, and again, he's only been in the league since 2020. He's a relatively inexperienced wide receiver, yet anytime he's been given opportunity to succeed, he's ran away with it. Going back to 2020, weeks 12 through 17, some wide receivers were out due to injury. He played 88.5% of the offensive snaps and averaged 10.73 fantasy points per game. Last season, similar scenario, weeks 14 through 18, he played 88.2% of the offensive snaps and was averaging 11.68 fantasy points per game. Mainly because Emmanuel Sanders, Cole Beasley, they pretty much tailed off, got injured late last season. And of course, Gabriel Davis stepped up in their stead. Now, speaking of Cole Beasley and Emmanuel Sanders, these are two guys that accounted for 184 total targets last season and are no longer in this offense. You look at what Emmanuel Sanders was able to do last year, weeks 1 through 6, averaging 13 fantasy points per game. Pretty good start, to say the very least. Cole Beasley, throughout that same range of time, weeks 1 through 8 last season, was averaging 9.83 fantasy points per game. Yet, they began to both tail off, find injuries. I know Cole Beasley was dealing with those rib injuries, and Emmanuel Sanders' age pretty much caught up to him, and he began to slow down. But there's so much potential opportunity in this offense now that those two guys are no longer there, especially for Gabriel Davis, because we know, Stephon Diggs is going to get his 165 targets. Maybe he goes up to 170 this year, but the other targets, the 180 that are potentially available at this current moment in time for Josh Allen to sling around the field are going to go into the direction of Gabriel Davis. Now, I'm not saying he's going to get all 180. I think 100 targets, 120 is very capable considering what kind of offense we're talking about. This offense has targeted their wide receiver position the second most time amongst all teams in the National Football League since 2020. Of course, yes, you're going to lose your offensive coordinator, Brian Daboll, but you still have guys that have been with the organization, who have been passing coordinators, quarterback coaches in this offense that are just going to keep it rolling. Again, Josh Allen, over the last 2 years, has had 4,400 passing yards and 36 passing touchdowns minimum the last 2 seasons. If you just continue in the right direction, nothing slowing down for the team that is currently favored to win the Super Bowl, I think Gabriel Davis should easily be a stud fantasy prospect. Now, what really separates him from the pack is the fact that he's going to have incredible touchdown upside. Of course, like I mentioned, Josh Allen, 36 minimum passing touchdowns each of the last 2 seasons. But when you look at Gabriel Davis and how he's been used in the red zone, last season, he was number 14 amongst all receiving options in the National Football League with 17 red zone targets, 8 of them coming from within the 10-yard line. Great opportunity. Now, if you go ahead and you siphon some of those opportunities off Cole Beasley and Emmanuel Sanders, which they had last year, they had 23 targets inside the red zone, 9 of them inside the 10-yard line, and you send those in the direction of Gabriel Davis, imagine what we can end up seeing. Those 4 touchdown games may not be as rare as they once were in the playoffs. Now, on top of that, the fact that this is a wide receiver that has speed and is not only going to be a red zone threat, that continues to elevate his game. In 2020, his rookie year, he led the Buffalo Bills in total deep targets, 20 or more yards down the field. He had 10 catches on those 20 targets for 5 receiving touchdowns. Now, last season, he had 15 targets, 20 or more yards down the field. Obviously, took a little bit of a step back in comparison to his rookie year, as Stephon Diggs and Emmanuel Sanders had more targets in those given categories. But nonetheless, Gabriel Davis is a deep threat. They've used him as such in the past, and they will continue to do so. And luckily for him, when we talk about deep passing accuracy over the last 2 years with Josh Allen, he's obviously been playing well. He's been number 4 last season and number 2 the year prior in terms of deep passes completed 20 or more yards down the field in the National Football League. Just continues to give me confidence in that matter going into 2022. That's why we should be drafting Gabriel Davis. Moving on, let's go ahead and talk about Marquise Brown. Now, I don't have him in an Arizona Cardinals uniform, but soon enough, we will all see him in said uniform dominating for this team. And the reason why, I mean, again, you go ahead and you move him from a Baltimore Ravens offense, a team that targeted their wide receivers the least amount of times since 2019, and you plug him into a Cliff Kingsbury, Kyler Murray combination. Man, the sky is going to be the limit. Now, in terms of ADP, on Underdog, we have Marquise Brown at 42.5. While you go to ESPN, it's at 57. You go to Yahoo, 82. NFL.com, 89. To say the very least, that is a pretty wide separation. Nonetheless, what we have seen from Marquise Brown over the last couple years has been improvement. And that's exactly what you want to see from a younger wide receiver. If you can take steps forward every single season, regardless of who's at the quarterback position, that is a perfect sign for a potential breakout in 2022. Again, in his rookie year was the number 46 wide receiver, then became the number 34. Last year was the number 23 wide receiver. And I think maybe he could get into this top 15 conversation at the end of 2022. Now, when we specifically look at what Marquise Brown accomplished last year, it does give us confidence. Again, from weeks 1 through 13, in the 11 games he played with Lamar Jackson under center, he was averaging 9 targets per game, 13.77 fantasy points per game, and throughout that span of time was the number 17 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. After Lamar Jackson left the lineup, he went back to averaging 5.8 fantasy points per game. But again, when you have the correct quarterback under center, you're going to obviously find success. And that's exactly what the case was in 2021. Again, the amount of targets that Marquise Brown was seeing throughout the first 11 games of his season was something that he had never experienced before. Again, when you look at the amount of times that he had been targeted 10 or more times in a singular game throughout his 3-year career with the Baltimore Ravens, he only twice was able to accomplish that in 2019 and 2020, and it accomplished that 7 times in the first 11 games with Lamar Jackson. Those are the exact numbers that are going to lead to fantasy success, and hopefully we'll see more of that in Arizona. Now again, the scheme in which the Baltimore Ravens were employing, of course, run first, Lamar Jackson, let it rip and let's see what happens. Hopefully Marquise Brown can run under it. That is going to be kind of turned up to, I would say a 15 out of 10. Because when you add him into the Kyler Murray-led offense, of course, these are former teammates in college at Oklahoma. The rapport is already there, and it's only going to develop as we have DeAndre Hopkins missing the first 6 games of the 2022 season. They're going to have to throw the ball a lot in those games. You play Kansas City week 1. You play Las Vegas. You play the Rams early. Again, these are very competitive contests in which they're going to be asked to do a lot in order to win these early games. And that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to sling the rock and they're going to send it in the direction of their number 1 wide receiver at the time. Now, let's not forget, in terms of running 3 wide receiver sets, running 4 wide receiver sets, Cliff Kingsbury has led the league since he's been the head coach of this team since 2019. On top of that fact, he's targeted their wide receivers the 7th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League, 1,104 over the last 3 seasons. Now, of course, when you're targeting a wide receiver like Marquise Brown, who has deadly speed and, of course, is a deep ball receiving threat, I mean, Kyler Murray is the perfect combination for him. In 2021, Kyler Murray was the most accurate quarterback, 20 or more yards down the field, had a 49.29% passing completion percentage, 35 completions on 71 total passing attempts. That led to 1,125 passing yards, which was second only behind Matthew Stafford, and 9 passing touchdowns, 20 or more yards down the field, was only third behind Kirk Cousins and Joe Burrow last season. So going into 2022, this is a perfect combination for a player like Marquise Brown to step up. Again, since 2019 with the Baltimore Ravens, he's had the 2nd most targets of 30 or more air yards. That's only second to Tyreek Hill in the National Football League. They're going to allow Marquise Brown to be a pure receiver in a pure passing offense and elevate his game. Now, speaking of, once Marquise Brown leaves his offense, who's going to step up and fill his spot? Because last season, he had 140 plus targets, and that kind of opportunity is no joke. Well, Rashod Bateman, a former first-round pick in the 2021 NFL Draft, he's going to be filling his spot. And Rashod Bateman, though he didn't find much fantasy success last season because he was dealing with an early injury and, of course, had to play second fiddle behind Marquise Brown, Sammy Watkins, and, of course, didn't have Lamar for majority of his season, we still think that there is a potential high upside breakout ability for a Rashod Bateman. Currently, Underdog's ADP of 53, while on ESPN 89 and Yahoo 85. There's a 30 pick difference between the two. And I don't even want to say where he's at on NFL.com. 125. I mean, holy moly. Now, when we look at weeks 1 through 13 of last season, the combination of targets that Marquise Brown and Sammy Watkins both saw, again, they're both no longer a part of this offense. That's 145 targets that led to 92 catches, 1,219 receiving yards, and 7 receiving touchdowns for 208.4 fantasy points. Now, throughout that span of time, of course, Lamar Jackson was throwing the ball more than he ever has in his entire career, averaging 34.36 passing attempts per game. That level of opportunity for his respective wide receivers was something that we had never seen before, mainly because the running game from Latavius Murray, Devontae Freeman, it just wasn't pulling its weight. So you had to continue to pass the ball in order to compete against these high-level teams in the National Football League. So this all being said, everything that I basically just mentioned regarding Marquise Brown pretty much fills into this conversation of Rashod Bateman. He's going to have number one opportunity. Again, the amount of times that Marquise Brown was targeted 10 or more times last season, 7 times within that 11-game span with Lamar Jackson. If you're able to get anything close to that in 2022, the breakout is already kind of written on the walls. I think Rashod Bateman certainly should be looked at as one of these players that you can have as a wide receiver 2. And if you're able to steal him as a wide receiver 3 because people in your league aren't paying attention and they're only looking at the ADPs available to them and, on these websites, this should be something you should be taking advantage of going into 2022. All right, let's talk about Michael Gallup. Michael Gallup is another one of these wide receivers that is being drafted relatively late. And I understand why. Of course, he's rehabbing from the ACL injury that he sustained on January 2nd, playing against the Arizona Cardinals while coming down with a touchdown receptions, tore his ACL. Unfortunate, but nonetheless, there's a lot of value to be had with Michael Gallup, mainly because his current underdog ADP is even low. 128.5, while on Yahoo 134, ESPN 167, NFL.com 136. So relatively kind of close everywhere across the board. But when I was thinking of wide receivers and their ADPs right now and where they could potentially finish at the end of, the 2022 season, when you compare him to Chris Godwin specifically, because again, Chris Godwin is in a similar situation. Chris Godwin tore his ACL on December 19th, just a couple weeks before Michael Gallup did. Yet Godwin's overall ADP on Underdog, 53.5, almost 80 picks ahead of Michael Gallup. While on Yahoo at 95, ESPN 70. On ESPN, the differential between two is 100 total picks. If you're able to take advantage of getting a Michael Gallup in your later rounds, double-digit rounds, I think he can certainly come back and be the number 2 wide receiver option of this offense. Again, let's not forget, throughout his career, he has found success when he has been a primary 1 or 2 option within the Dallas Cowboys offense. You go back to 2019, he was the number 22 overall wide receiver with 179.7 fantasy points within that given year. That was prior to CeeDee Lamb joining the roster. Now you go ahead and you exit out Amari Cooper and Cedric Wilson, who accounted for 164 total targets last year, 113 receptions, over 1,400 receiving yards, 14 touchdowns, almost 300 fantasy points between the two of those receivers. Those are up for grabs. And though Jalen Tolbert could be a guy that could step in and maybe make some plays, he's still an inexperienced wide receiver that is coming from a smaller college. And it's not out of the realm of possibility of a guy stepping up and becoming an immediate option. But once, in fact, Michael Gallup is healthy and ready to go, he should be able to play and play well for this football team. Again, earlier today, I think Jerry Jones said that if, in fact, we were playing a Super Bowl next week, Michael Gallup would be lining up and playing for us. That's how ready he is for the 2022 season. And though they may not be able to put him in the lineup for weeks 1 through 3, I think being able to invest in a player way later down in the double-digit rounds who can certainly give you a fantasy point influx from weeks 4 through 16, where you really need him to play, I think it's a definite investment I want to be making. Again, when I've looked at his career from 2019 through 2021 with the Dallas Cowboys, when he's been given enough opportunity to where he can catch 5 or more receptions in a game, when he's had 5 or more catches in those last 3 years, he's averaged 15.7 fantasy points per game. And in 11 of those 16 games where he was able to accomplish that, he was able to put up 10 or more fantasy points. That's 70% of the time. Again, there's a lot of potential for a Michael Gallup who's kind of being slept on via ADP and where he could potentially end up. And I understand coming back from an ACL injury is relatively devastating, but look at where we have guys like Chris Godwin. Look at where we have guys, specifically J.K. Dobbins, Cam Akers. We are hoping for the best possible scenario. Why not go ahead and make such an investment at a lower end on a wide receiver who is associated with an offense that last season was in the top 5, was putting up a lot of points. And yes, they're missing a couple pieces this year, but maybe we get Dak Prescott in those shootout contests throwing the ball a lot. especially even fact the running game is going to slow down because of Zeke, because of Tyron Smith, they're going to be throwing the ball the entire game. Michael Gallup eventually will find himself a lot of success in fantasy, so you should be drafting him. All right, that pretty much covers our must-draft wide receivers going into the 2022 fantasy football season. Of course, we'll be talking about more wide receivers, more running backs in the coming days prior to your upcoming drafts. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, click the like button down below, and let me know down in the comment section which other wide receivers who are currently at a pretty lower value on these different websites are you going after, are you prioritizing in your upcoming drafts. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Be sure to also check out Underdog Fantasy. Again, I referenced their ADPs, and I can assure you the drafts over there are extremely competitive. So if you're trying to gain a lot of experience this offseason in terms of drafting, that's the best place to do it. If you sign up today using promo code Andrew and make a first-time deposit, I think the minimum deposit is $10, you'll not only get a first-time deposit match up to $100, but you'll also get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings, which will also be updated on Saturday morning. So you'll get 2 emails, one within 24 hours from me and one Saturday morning, so that if you're drafting this upcoming weekend, you're ready to go and able to win a 2022 fantasy football championship this year. Anyway, thank you, everybody, for watching. And until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.